My wife left me at 30, and she did it so cleanly I almost had to admire the planning. One Thursday evening in February, I came back to our condo in Etobicoke to find 3 cardboard boxes stacked outside our unit door with a yellow sticky note on top. The note said, in her neat, rounded handwriting, "I think you know." I didn't, actually. I stood in the hallway in my coat and snow boots for a solid 2 minutes, thinking there had been some mistake. There hadn't been. My wife had been seeing her personal training client, a man she'd met at the Yorkdale Good Life, for 8 months. She filed for divorce the following week. Her father retained the firm he kept on retainer for his real estate company, a team of 3 lawyers whose combined billable rate made my stomach drop when I found out. I had a legal aid consult and a guy I'd found online with decent reviews. The thing people don't tell you about divorce when your spouse comes from money is that it's not really a legal proceeding. It's a demolition. My father-in-law had spent 22 years building Westbrook Developments into one of the largest private residential construction firms in the Greater Toronto area. He wasn't about to let a 6-year marriage cost his family anything significant. Ontario family law provides for equalization of net family property. In theory, you split what you each built during the marriage. In practice, if one side has a forensic accounting team and the other side has someone who answers calls after noon, the math looks very different by the time mediation is done. I had walked away from a structural engineering position at a firm in Mississauga to come work at Westbrook. My wife had asked me to. Said her father needed someone he could trust running project coordination. I managed timelines, budgets, subcontractor schedules. I was good at it. During those 5 years, my engineering license sat mostly dormant, my professional network quietly calcified, and my name appeared on precisely 0 industry projects. On paper, that sacrifice was worth nothing because I had drawn a salary. On paper, the condo we lived in had been purchased before the marriage with a gift from her parents. On paper, my father-in-law's company had hit a rough patch, 2 fiscal years of reported losses, so my wife's share of the family business was suddenly, helpfully negligible. The judge awarded me a settlement that wouldn't have covered 3 months of my old salary, plus time-limited spousal support. 6 months after the papers were signed, I was renting a room in a house in Hamilton, sharing a bathroom with 2 strangers, and staring at an account balance of $912. I was 30 years old. My engineering license needed significant renewal work I didn't have the cash to pursue. My wife had just posted photos from Portugal with the trainer. I'm not going to dress it up. That period was the worst of my life. I stopped opening my banking app. I ate a lot of no-name pasta. I was not a person I particularly recognized. Then my great-uncle's estate lawyer called. I almost didn't pick up. Unknown number, Nova Scotia area code. It rang through. They called again. Something made me answer the second time. The lawyer told me my great-uncle, my grandfather's youngest brother, a man I had met perhaps twice at family gatherings, had died quietly at his property in Cape Breton 2 months prior. He had been 79 years old. No spouse, no children, no close relatives. He'd lived alone on his land for decades, and he had left everything he owned to me. My great-uncle's property was 28 acres of mixed woodland and overgrown pasture near Baddeck, Cape Breton Island. There was a farmhouse, a large timber frame barn, and an old grain silo that had stopped being used in the 1980s. The lawyer said the land was beautiful, but the structures were in significant disrepair. He said this carefully. The way you tell someone their dog is resting comfortably. The catch. My great-uncle hadn't paid municipal property taxes in 7 years. The arrears, with penalties and interest, had accumulated to just over $15,000 Canadian. The Cape Breton Regional Municipality had already initiated the tax sale process. If I didn't clear the debt within 35 days, the property would go to auction. I would inherit nothing. $15,000. I had $912. I thought about calling my mum, but she was on a fixed pension, and I wasn't about to put that on her. I thought about a personal loan, but my credit had taken damage in the divorce proceedings, and the bank wasn't interested. I sat on the edge of my rented bed and did something I already knew I would regret. I called my father-in-law. He picked up on the second ring. I explained the situation calmly. The property, the tax arrears, the deadline. I told him I'd repay him within 60 days once I'd assessed the land's value and started a sale process. I kept my voice professional. I presented it like a business proposal, because that was the language he respected. He let me finish. Then he laughed. It was a short sound, dismissive, the kind of laugh you give a parking ticket before tossing it in the glove compartment. Son, he said. He still called me that, which was its own particular kind of cruelty. You're talking about a derelict farm in Cape Breton. I've seen properties like that. They're worth less than the back taxes. Walk away. Let the municipality have it. A pause. I genuinely wish you the best. He hung up. I sat there for a moment. Then I felt something shift in my chest. It wasn't grief. It wasn't even anger, exactly. It was something quieter and colder and considerably more useful. I looked at my watch, the one good watch I owned, a Tag Heuer my mum had given me when I passed my engineering boards, which I had worn every day since and never once considered selling. I took it off my wrist. I drove to a pawn shop on Barton Street, told the man behind the counter exactly what the secondary market rate was, and that I'd take my business across the road if he didn't match it. He matched it. I walked out with $16,200 in cash. I wired $15,040 to the Cape Breton Regional Municipality that evening. I packed a duffel bag. I borrowed my roommate's truck. I drove 14 hours to Nova Scotia. My great-uncle's property was worse than I'd expected, and I had expected bad. The farmhouse had significant water damage across the rear of the structure. The barn's loft was partially collapsed on one side. The silo was structurally intact. I walked around it carefully, tapping the concrete, but everything else looked like it had been slowly exhaling for 30 years. The fields were hip-deep in goldenrod and alderbrush. The lake at the back of the property was beautiful, though, steel gray and very still in the early March cold. I stood there for a few minutes and just breathed. One thing at a time. I had nowhere else to be. I spent the first 3 weeks clearing, cleaning, and cataloging. I was a project coordinator by training. I knew how to break a large problem into sequential tasks. I gutted the farmhouse of debris, repaired a roof leak over the kitchen, well enough to keep the rain out, restored power through the main panel, and got the well pump running again. But my great-uncle's actual belongings were a different matter. The man was not what most people would call a hoarder. What he was, I began to realize as I sorted through the barn and the farmhouse's back rooms, was a record keeper, an obsessive, meticulous, lifelong record keeper. There were filing boxes organized by year going back to 1971, ledgers, bank statements, newspaper clippings, copies of property deeds, correspondence with law firms in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, genealogical research on families I didn't recognize, annotated in my great-uncle's small, precise handwriting, names, dates, property transfers, corporate filings. He had kept track of people and transactions for decades, with the discipline of someone who had been formally trained to do so. I had no idea what I was looking at. The answer started coming together on a Tuesday night in week 4, during a late April rainstorm that turned the back fields into a shallow lake. A section of the barn's upper loft had been leaking, a slow drip I'd been watching for days, and the patch I'd applied earlier had shifted. I climbed the loft ladder in the dark with a headlamp and a bucket. Moving the tarpaulins to reach the leak, I knocked one of the wooden crates sideways. It was heavier than it looked, much heavier. I steadied it, then looked at it properly for the first time. It was a military surplus footlocker, old steel construction, olive drab paint worn to bare metal in patches, secured with a padlock that had been good quality once. I'd walked past it a dozen times, assuming it was tools. I got a pry bar from the truck. Inside the footlocker, beneath a layer of oilskin cloth, were 6 passports. They all had photographs of my great-uncle at different ages, spanning what looked like the 1960s through the 1980s. None of them used his real name. There were 2 Canadian social insurance cards under different names, a Quebec driver's license from 1979, and a New Brunswick health card from 1983. My great-uncle, it turned out, had been a man who moved through the world under at least 3 separate identities. Below the documents was a journal. The entries were written in a simple number substitution cipher. Not sophisticated, but enough to slow a casual reader considerably. I photographed every page with my phone, and tucked into the very back cover of the journal, folded once, was a hand-drawn diagram. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at, and then it clicked. It was a cross-section of the grain silo. The concrete foundation showed a subfloor cavity with an access point, drawn in my great-uncle's precise pencil lines. At the bottom of the diagram, underlined twice, were 4 words, "For whoever comes next." I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I walked to the silo with a flashlight, the diagram, and the pry bar. The interior floor was poured concrete. I had looked at it before and seen nothing unusual, but according to the diagram, the access point was beneath a metal inspection grate in the northeast quadrant. I found the grate, welded down with what looked like decades of paint and rust. I worked the pry bar into the seam and pulled. The weld broke on the 4th try. The grate swung up on a hinge I hadn't known was there. Below it was a concrete shaft about 12 feet deep, with iron rungs set into the wall. Cold, dry air rose from the darkness. I lowered myself down. The bunker at the bottom was small, perhaps 4 meters by 4 meters, with poured concrete walls and a bare concrete floor. A battery-operated lantern sat on a wooden shelf, and when I switched it on, it still worked. In the center of the room stood a commercial fire safe, a Diebold model, late 1970s manufacture, black steel with a brass combination dial. Next to it, on the shelf, was a framed photograph. 2 men in suits standing outside a restaurant. The sign was in French, somewhere in Montreal. My great-uncle on the right, a man I didn't recognize on the left. On the back of the photograph, taped with yellowed masking tape, was an index card with a combination sequence written in my great-uncle's handwriting. My hands were shaking badly enough that I needed 3 attempts to work the dial. But I got it. The bolts disengaged. The door swung open. The safe held several vacuum-sealed bricks of currency, discontinued Canadian $1,000 bills, taken out of circulation in 2000, but still fully legal tender. There were enough of them, stacked in orderly rows, that my brain stopped processing the total after the first few seconds. Below the currency were 4 cloth bags. I opened the nearest one. Canadian gold maple leaf bullion coins, each one troy ounce, gleaming under the lantern light. I sat down on the concrete floor and pressed my back against the wall of the bunker and just stayed there for a while. But what changed everything was pushed to the back of the safe's lower shelf, a ledger thick bound in dark green cloth, heavy enough that I needed both hands. Embossed on the front cover in gold foil, now mostly faded, the Westbrook file. I knew that name. I opened the ledger on the floor of that bunker, under the single lantern, in absolute silence. Unlike the cipher journal, this one was written in plain English, clear, methodical, precise. It was a financial record spanning from 1981 to 2011, 30 years of transactions, corporate structure diagrams, routing numbers, and signed agreements. My great-uncle, I began to understand, had not been a simple Cape Breton farmer with a mysterious past. He had been a professional intermediary. A man who moved money through legitimate real estate transactions on behalf of people who needed that service done quietly, who was careful and left almost no trace of himself in public records. His biggest long-term client, beginning in the early 1980s, was a family-owned development company based in Toronto, a company that had grown over 3 decades into one of the largest private residential construction firms in the Greater Toronto area, Westbrook Developments. My father-in-law's company, the company where I had spent 5 years of my life working. The first 40 pages were a detailed paper trail, original wire transfer records, nominee shareholder agreements, offshore corporate structures registered in the Isle of Man and the British Virgin Islands, and, more recently, numbered Alberta shell companies. The money that had flowed through my great-uncle's accounts over 2 decades had originated with construction contract arrangements that the Charbonneau Commission later began exposing in Quebec. My father-in-law's father, the man who had founded Westbrook, had been one of the network's primary Ontario clients from the beginning. But it was the final 30 pages that made me close the ledger and sit very still for a long time. Those pages covered 2008 to 2011, and the handwriting shifted. My great-uncle's notations alongside a different hand, younger and more hurried. The second set of entries showed transfers from accounts I recognized, numbered companies whose tax filings I had personally coordinated during my time at Westbrook. Internal accounts, I had been told explicitly, were standard corporate liquidity management. What the ledger showed was that those accounts had been used systematically to funnel undisclosed assets into offshore structures, the same offshore structures my father-in-law had sworn, under oath, did not exist during my divorce mediation. He had lied to the court. He had structured his finances and coached my wife on how to present hers, in a way that had been built on 3 decades of fraud. And the man who had kept the most complete record of all of it had left me that record deliberately, tucked beneath a Cape Breton grain silo, for exactly this kind of moment. I thought about what my father-in-law had said on the phone. Walk away. Let the municipality have it. He didn't know the file existed. He did not know I had it. I did not call the police. I did not call my mum. I told nobody. Instead, I drove to Halifax, checked into a motel, and spent 2 days researching federal tax whistleblower attorneys across Canada. The Canada Revenue Agency operates the Offshore Tax Informant Program. It pays between 5 and 15% of all additional federal tax collected, provided the evaded amount exceeds $100,000. The amount documented in the Westbrook file was not $100,000. It was considerably, staggeringly more. The attorney I found had spent 12 years as a CRA Special Investigations Auditor before moving to private practice. I sat across from her in her Halifax office on a Thursday afternoon and placed the ledger on her desk. I explained the marriage, the divorce, and the 5 years I had spent inside Westbrook, watching things I hadn't understood at the time. She listened without interrupting. Then she read for 40 minutes in silence. When she closed the ledger, she took her glasses off. This is the most complete third-party financial record of a continuous tax evasion scheme I have seen in 13 years of practice, she said. Your father-in-law didn't just avoid taxes. He's been running a deliberate, multi-generational concealment operation, and based on the divorce filings you've described, he almost certainly suborned perjury. A pause. What do you want out of this? I had thought about that question the entire drive from Baddeck to Halifax. I want him to watch everything he built get dismantled, I said. I want it done properly, through the system, so there's no way for him to claim it was personal. She nodded slowly. Then we don't just hand this to the CRA and wait for a reassessment. We build something first. Over the following 6 weeks, working quietly from a rented cottage outside Baddeck, I used a portion of the liquidated gold, sold in tranches through 3 separate bullion dealers across Atlantic Canada, to establish a numbered Nova Scotia company. Through my attorney's network, that company identified and purchased a significant piece of Westbrook's construction financing. My father-in-law had been carrying a large mezzanine loan against a condominium tower under construction in North York. A project I knew from my years inside Westbrook was operating on thinner margins than the public financing documents suggested. My company purchased a portion of that loan from the lending syndicate at a premium. Then I sent a letter. A courier envelope arrived at Westbrook's head office on a Monday morning, addressed to my father-in-law personally. Inside was a single sheet, a photocopy of 1 page from the Westbrook file, showing a specific Isle of Man account number and a transfer authorization bearing his signature. The same account he had stated in a signed affidavit, filed with the Ontario court during my divorce, did not exist. Below the photocopy was a typed note. I found the file. Check your financing. The same morning, my company issued a notice of default on the construction loan, citing material misrepresentation in the borrower's financial disclosures. Full repayment of $38 million was required within 72 hours, or the lender would assume operational control of the project and begin liquidation against the borrower's corporate assets. My attorney called that evening. His lawyers contacted the lender, she said. They want to know who the principal is. They're asking for an emergency meeting. A brief pause. The CRA has also placed a quiet hold on 4 of the offshore accounts flagged in our preliminary filing. He tried to move funds this afternoon to cover the margin call. The wire triggered a financial intelligence flag. The RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit has been briefed. I drove to Toronto the next morning. I had a suit dry cleaned and pressed near my old Etobicoke neighborhood. I sat in a conference room on the 34th floor of an office tower in the financial district, and I waited. My father-in-law arrived with 4 lawyers, 2 of them senior partners I recognized from the divorce proceedings. He looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days. The casual certainty of a man who had always believed that money made consequence negotiable, the posture I had watched him perform my entire marriage, was entirely gone. He looked at the table, at his lawyers, at the window, at everything except the door where my attorney was standing. Then the door opened, and I walked in. My father-in-law went still. His lead lawyer said something I didn't catch, and my attorney answered, explaining that I was the principal investor of the company holding the loan. The lawyers started talking over each other. My father-in-law didn't move. He was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. It took me a moment to identify it, because it looked so foreign on his face. It was fear. "You should sit down," I said. "There's a lot to go through." His lawyers negotiated for the next hour, as lawyers do. They offered equity stakes, restructured timelines, letters of intent. My attorney declined each offer politely and redirected to the outstanding default notice. At one point, my father-in-law attempted to speak to me directly, to appeal to the years I had worked for him, to the idea that we could resolve this quietly between ourselves, as family. I listened to him. I let him finish. "I spent 5 years building your company," I said. "I watched your daughter's marriage end, and I walked out of mediation with less than 1 year of my own salary. I found what my great-uncle left me, and I'm going to let the people whose job it is to handle this do their job." I nodded to my attorney. She made a call. 6 minutes later, 2 plainclothes RCMP officers from the Integrated Financial Crime Unit came through the conference room door with identification and a warrant. They asked my father-in-law to stand. They explained the charges: tax evasion, fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice in a civil proceeding. His lead lawyer immediately declared a conflict of interest and began gathering his files. The others went very quiet. I didn't watch them walk him out. I was looking out the window at the city my great-uncle had apparently spent decades quietly documenting, one transaction at a time, from a farmhouse 800 kilometers away. My father-in-law was eventually convicted on 6 counts, receiving a sentence of 14 years in a federal penitentiary. The CRA's assessment of the Westbrook file resulted in one of the largest tax recovery actions in Ontario in over a decade. Under the Offshore Tax Informant Program, I received 14.5% of the recovered federal taxes, a figure that took 3 separate conversations with my attorney before the number stopped feeling abstract. Westbrook Developments was seized and sold off in pieces by court order. My wife, who the court found had knowingly misrepresented her family's net worth during our divorce proceedings, faced separate civil proceedings. She and the personal trainer had parted ways long before the first warrant was issued. I went back to Cape Breton. It took me 2.5 years to restore my great-uncle's property the way I wanted it done, properly, with good materials, without rushing. The farmhouse is solid now. The barn has been re-timbered and re-roofed. I converted the old silo into a studio tower which sounds grander than it is, but the view from the top across the lake in the late afternoon is genuinely one of the best things I've ever seen. I renewed my professional engineering license. I work part of the year as a consultant, mostly on rural infrastructure projects in Atlantic Canada. A structural engineer with real project management experience and no need to maximize his billing rate turns out to be useful in parts of the country that larger firms overlook. The work is good. My great-uncle had one framed photograph in that bunker, and I kept it. It sits on the mantelpiece in the farmhouse. I don't know who the other man in the photograph is, and at this point I've made a kind of peace with not knowing. What I do know is that my great-uncle spent his life keeping records because he understood that documentation is a form of power, and that power, correctly applied, has a longer reach than money alone. He left me 28 acres and a very specific kind of inheritance for whoever came next. I came next, and I used it well. If you found something like that hidden away, something that could change everything, what would you do? Take the money and walk away quietly, or stay and do what needed to be done? Let me know in the comments. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe to Royal Murmurs. We'll be here.